Corporal James Henry Callahan crouched in the frozen mud along the Roa River on the night of February 9th, 1945, his fingers bleeding as he twisted copper antenna wire into configurations that would make his commanding officers furious if they ever discovered what he was doing. The official orders had been explicit: maintain defensive positions, conserve materials, await reinforcement. But Callahan had spent 3 nights watching German patrols probe their thinly stretched line, testing for weaknesses, and he knew that following orders meant death for every man in his platoon. The antenna wire came from a destroyed radio truck, salvaged piece by piece over the previous week, while his sergeant looked the other way. Now, in near total darkness, with the temperature dropping to 18 degrees below zero, Callahan was weaving something the Army had never authorized, never imagined, and certainly never approved. A tripwire system so elaborate and disturbing in its design that it would soon terrify an entire German battalion into retreat. In that moment, Callahan knew disobeying could end his career, court-martial him for destruction of military property, or brand him as insubordinate. But he also knew that innovation, not obedience, would determine whether his brothers-in-arms saw another sunrise. James Henry Callahan had been born on June 3, 1922, in a farming community outside Salina, Kansas, where his father operated a small radio repair shop alongside their wheat fields. The Great Depression had taught young James 2 fundamental lessons: waste nothing and make everything work twice as long as it was designed to last. His childhood had been spent rewiring broken radios, fashioning replacement parts from scrap metal, and learning that official manuals often described ideal conditions that never existed in real life. When he enlisted in the Army on December 15, 1942, 3 weeks after his 20th birthday, his motivations were straightforward. His older brother had died at Guadalcanal, his mother needed the military salary he could send home, and staying on the farm felt like cowardice when the world was burning. Basic training at Fort Riley revealed that Callahan possessed no particular athletic gifts, no remarkable marksmanship, and certainly no officer potential. His drill instructors considered him adequate, nothing more. What they failed to notice was his habit of studying how things broke, how systems failed, and how desperate men improvised solutions when regulations offered nothing useful. Callahan arrived in Europe with the 78th Infantry Division in October 1944, assigned to Company K of the 310th Infantry Regiment. His fellow soldiers nicknamed him Radio within a week, partly because of his father's profession, partly because he seemed to communicate in frequencies nobody else could hear. He had a way of predicting equipment failures, of sensing when supply lines would collapse, of knowing which official plans would crumble under battlefield reality. His platoon leader, Lieutenant Robert Marsh, initially dismissed Callahan as pessimistic, possibly cowardly, certainly not someone to trust with leadership responsibilities. The other men in the squad tolerated him, appreciated his ability to fix broken equipment, but didn't consider him brave in any traditional sense. He never volunteered for patrols, rarely spoke during briefings, and spent his free time sketching diagrams in a notebook that nobody understood. The 78th Division had entered combat during the brutal autumn campaign to penetrate the Siegfried Line, and Callahan's first exposure to German defenses filled him with a growing frustration. The enemy used wire in ways American doctrine never considered. Not just barbed obstacles, but elaborate sensory networks that detected movement, channeled attacks into kill zones, and created psychological barriers more effective than concrete bunkers. By January 1945, Callahan had survived 2 months of combat that killed or wounded nearly half of his original company. He had participated in the grinding advance through the Hurtgen forest, where trees exploded into wooden shrapnel, and every 100 yards cost dozens of lives. He had watched men follow orders that made no tactical sense, dying because doctrine demanded obedience over adaptation. During those frozen weeks, Callahan began collecting wire from every source imaginable: telephone lines, damaged vehicles, destroyed equipment, even German positions after they were overrun. His squadmates thought he was mentally unstable, hoarding trash while rational men conserved energy. Lieutenant Marsh ordered him to stop twice, but Callahan complied only superficially, hiding his growing collection in abandoned buildings and shell craters. He was studying German wire techniques, reverse engineering their detection systems, understanding the psychology of obstacles that existed more in the mind than in physical space. The official Field Manual 3-5 covered wire obstacles in exactly 17 pages, with standardized configurations designed for construction by engineering units with proper materials and sufficient time. Callahan had neither proper materials nor sufficient time, but he had something the manual's authors never possessed: first-hand knowledge of what actually terrified soldiers in darkness. The broader strategic situation in February 1945 centered on the Allied push toward the Rhine River, following the costly victory in the Battle of the Bulge. The 78th Infantry Division occupied positions along the Roer River, holding a thinly stretched defensive line, while more powerful units prepared for the major offensive crossings to the south. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces in the sector consisted primarily of Volksgrenadier divisions, second-line units composed of older men, teenagers, and recovered wounded. American commanders considered them demoralized, low-quality troops unlikely to mount serious attacks. This assessment proved catastrophically wrong. The German 59th Infantry Division, facing Callahan's regiment, had been reinforced with veterans from the Eastern Front, men who had survived years of combat against Soviet forces and possessed a ruthless competence that American intelligence failed to detect. These were not the broken remnants of a defeated army, but experienced killers who specialized in night infiltration, silent throat-cutting, and the kind of close-quarters savagery that destroyed morale more effectively than artillery. Company K held a position along a bend in the Roer River where the defensive lines stretched to breaking point. Lieutenant Marsh commanded approximately 90 men responsible for defending nearly 800 yards of riverbank, a sector that required at least 250 soldiers according to standard doctrine. The company's defensive positions consisted of hastily dug foxholes connected by shallow communication trenches, with minimal overhead protection and no prepared fallback positions. Behind them, the nearest reinforcements were positioned 3 miles away, and the frozen ground made rapid movement nearly impossible. The official defensive plan relied on artillery support from the 112th Field Artillery Battalion, but ammunition shortages meant that fire missions were strictly rationed. Company K was essentially alone, and everyone knew it. The Roer River itself provided minimal protection, because winter temperatures had created ice bridges capable of supporting infantry movement. German patrols had been testing these ice bridges for 5 consecutive nights, probing American positions, withdrawing before dawn, gathering intelligence about gaps and weaknesses. February 8, 1945, brought a warning that changed everything. A captured German soldier, interrogated by divisional intelligence, revealed that his battalion had orders to conduct a major raid across the Roer River within 48 hours. The objective was to seize prisoners, destroy equipment, and create chaos behind American lines before the expected Allied offensive. The prisoner estimated that at least 300 soldiers would participate in the raid, supported by mortars and machine guns positioned on the eastern bank. When this intelligence reached Company K, Lieutenant Marsh held an emergency briefing. The mathematics were devastating: 90 defenders against 300 attackers, with minimal support and no reinforcement possible. Marsh requested permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Division headquarters denied the request. Marsh asked for emergency ammunition resupply and additional troops. Division promised to consider the request, but made no commitments. The message was clear: Company K would hold its position with existing resources, regardless of the odds. That night, Callahan approached Lieutenant Marsh with a proposal that sounded insane. He wanted to create an improvised detection and deterrent system using salvaged antenna wire, spending the next 2 nights constructing an elaborate network that would alert defenders to enemy movement and, more importantly, convince German soldiers that the American position was far more heavily defended than reality suggested. Marsh's initial reaction was dismissive. The idea violated multiple regulations regarding unauthorized use of materials, construction of non-standard obstacles, and individual initiative beyond approved parameters. More fundamentally, Marsh doubted whether copper wire could accomplish anything that proper defensive preparations had failed to achieve. Callahan explained his theory with an intensity that surprised the lieutenant. German soldiers feared wire more than bullets because wire represented the unknown. In darkness, a man couldn't see how much wire existed, where it led, or what it might trigger. The psychological impact of encountering unexpected wire exceeded its physical barrier effect. Furthermore, Callahan had observed that German patrol techniques relied on stealth and silence. If he could create a system that made silent movement impossible, that produced noise with every step, the enemy would either abort the raid or reveal their positions prematurely. Lieutenant Marsh remained skeptical, but desperation overrode his doubts. He gave Callahan unofficial permission to proceed, with the understanding that if anything went wrong, Marsh would deny all knowledge and Callahan would face court-martial alone. Sergeant Thomas Kowalski, a Pennsylvania coal miner who led Callahan's squad, volunteered to help, partly from loyalty, partly from curiosity. 2 other soldiers joined them. Private First Class Leonard Chen, a San Francisco mechanic who understood structural engineering, and Private Edward Murphy, a former theater stagehand who specialized in creating effects with minimal resources. Together, these 4 men began constructing something that would become legendary in the annals of improvised warfare. The antenna wire came from 6 destroyed radio trucks that Callahan had located over the previous month. Each truck yielded approximately 200 feet of copper wire, varying in thickness from hair-thin strands to cables thick as a pencil. Callahan had been studying the properties of each type, testing how they responded to tension, temperature, and vibration. The thinnest wire, nearly invisible in daylight and completely undetectable at night, would form the trip components. The thicker wire would create the psychological barriers and noise-generating elements. The construction began on the night of February 9th and continued through February 10th. The 4 men worked in 2-hour shifts, crawling through the frozen ground between their foxholes and the river, laying wire in patterns that seemed random but followed a sophisticated design Callahan had perfected through weeks of experimentation. The system consisted of 3 integrated components, each serving a distinct purpose. The outer detection layer used ultra-thin wire, positioned 6 inches above the ground, spanning the entire 800-yard sector in irregular intervals. This wire was nearly invisible and easily broken, but breaking it was the point. Callahan had attached each strand to empty ration cans filled with small stones and suspended from tree branches or fence posts. When a soldier's boot caught the tripwire, the tension released and the can dropped, creating a rattling noise that carried hundreds of yards in the frozen night air. The Germans would hear noise but couldn't determine its source or significance. Was it defensive preparation? An alarm system? Evidence of heavy fortification? The uncertainty would slow their advance, make them cautious, rob them of the speed that made infiltration effective. The middle layer consisted of what Callahan called screamers, a design he had adapted from German techniques observed in the Hürtgen forest. He took thicker antenna wire and strung it between trees and posts at chest height, creating barriers that weren't meant to be invisible, but rather deliberately obvious to anyone using artificial light or flares. However, he attached these wires to more elaborate noise-making devices. Empty ammunition boxes filled with metal fragments, suspended from branches by thin wire, that would snap when the main wire was pulled. The falling boxes created crashes loud enough to wake sleeping soldiers and convinced anyone listening that defensive positions were being attacked or reinforced. More importantly, the middle layer created a psychological trap. German soldiers encountering the obvious chest-high wires would assume they had discovered the extent of American defenses and feel clever for detecting them. They would slow down, look for ways around or under the visible barriers, and in doing so become more vulnerable to the hidden outer detection layer they had already triggered without realizing it. The inner layer was Callahan's masterpiece of psychological warfare. He created what appeared to be a sophisticated communications network using the thickest antenna wire, running it between foxholes in elaborate patterns that suggested buried telephone lines or detonation wires for explosive charges. In reality, these wires connected to nothing and served no functional purpose except creating the illusion of extensive defensive preparation. Callahan deliberately left portions of this wire partially exposed, as if hasty construction had failed to bury everything properly. He positioned empty wooden boxes near the wire runs, boxes that resembled the containers used for anti-personnel mines, but actually contained nothing except dirt and rocks. The German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front knew what properly prepared Soviet defenses looked like, and Callahan was creating a replica that matched their worst expectations. He wanted them to believe they were attacking a position that had been fortified for weeks, defended by engineering specialists, backed by resources that didn't exist. Throughout the 2 nights of construction, the temperature remained brutally cold, dropping to 23 degrees below zero on February 10th. Callahan's hands suffered severe frostbite, his fingers swelling until he could barely grip the wire. Chen developed hypothermia after falling through thin ice while positioning tripwires near the riverbank, and Murphy fractured his ankle when he stumbled into a shell crater in the darkness. But they continued working because the alternative was waiting passively for an attack they couldn't survive. Sergeant Kowalski coordinated with the rest of the platoon, ensuring that defenders knew where the tripwires were positioned so they wouldn't trigger their own detection system. He also spread rumors among the company that engineering specialists had arrived with advanced defensive equipment, encouraging his own soldiers to believe they were better protected than reality suggested. Morale improved slightly, though most men remained convinced they would die when the German raid came. Lieutenant Marsh monitored the construction with growing amazement. He had expected Callahan to string some basic tripwires and perhaps create a few noisemakers. Instead, he was witnessing the creation of a defensive system so elaborate and psychologically sophisticated that it resembled professional engineering work. On the morning of February 11th, Marsh walked the defensive line with Callahan, inspecting the completed installation. From the American foxholes, the wire network was barely visible, except where Callahan had deliberately made it obvious. From the German side of the river, however, the system created an impression of depth and preparation that transformed Company K's position from vulnerable to formidable. Marsh asked Callahan where he had learned these techniques. Callahan explained that he hadn't learned them anywhere. He had simply observed what terrified soldiers, including himself, and designed a system that maximized terror while minimizing actual resources. Fear, Callahan argued, was more effective than firepower when used properly. The German raid began at 0300 hours on February 12, 1945. The initial assault force consisted of approximately 280 soldiers from the 59th Infantry Division's 173rd Grenadier Regiment, organized into 6 platoons with specific objectives. Penetrate American lines, seize prisoners, destroy equipment, and withdraw before dawn. German intelligence believed they faced a demoralized, understrength American company with minimal defensive preparation. The raiders crossed the frozen Roa River in complete silence, moving in single file across ice bridges they had identified during previous reconnaissance patrols. They carried suppressed weapons, knives, grenades, and wire cutters, expecting to encounter basic barbed wire obstacles and sleeping sentries. The 1st German platoon, advancing toward the northern section of Company K's position, triggered Callahan's outer detection layer within minutes of leaving the riverbank. The rattling of falling cans created immediate confusion. The German platoon leader assumed they had encountered an American patrol and ordered his men to freeze in place, waiting for gunfire that never came. After 5 minutes of silence, he ordered a cautious advance. His soldiers moved 3 more steps before triggering additional tripwires, creating more rattling noises that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The German soldiers, trained to trust silence and stealth, suddenly found themselves in an environment where every movement created noise. They couldn't determine if they had triggered alarm systems, defensive traps, or merely clumsy construction debris. The uncertainty paralyzed their advance. Meanwhile, American defenders in their foxholes heard the rattling and knew exactly what it meant. Enemy soldiers were entangled in Callahan's detection system. Lieutenant Marsh ordered his men to hold fire, letting the Germans advance deeper into the wire network. The 2nd German platoon, attacking the center of the American line, encountered Callahan's middle layer of screamers within 10 minutes. When they pulled the chest-high wires, the falling ammunition boxes created crashes so loud that soldiers on both sides assumed a major firefight had begun. The German platoon leader, convinced his position was compromised, fired a flare to illuminate the battlefield. The flare revealed an astonishing sight: wire everywhere, running in patterns that suggested elaborate defensive preparation, connecting to boxes and posts that resembled a professional engineering installation. The 3rd and 4th German platoons, advancing toward the southern sector, triggered so many tripwires and noisemakers that their commanders became convinced they were attacking a heavily fortified position, defended by far more soldiers than intelligence had suggested. Radio communications between the German platoons revealed growing panic. One platoon leader reported encountering extensive wire obstacles indicating regimental strength defensive preparation. Another reported possible minefield with detonation wires visible across entire sector. A third warned that American positions appear to have been fortified for extended period with engineering support. None of these assessments were accurate, but the wire created evidence that confirmed every fear. The German battalion commander, listening to these reports from his command post across the river, faced a terrible decision. His intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of attacking a weak, demoralized company, his raiders were entangled in a sophisticated defensive system that suggested American forces had been preparing for this exact attack. Continuing the assault meant accepting casualties that the operation's objectives couldn't justify. At 03:45 hours, exactly 45 minutes after the raid began, the German battalion commander ordered his forces to withdraw. The retreat was chaotic and costly. German soldiers, convinced they were escaping a trap, moved carelessly through the wire network, triggering dozens of additional noisemakers and creating the impression of a full-scale battle despite minimal actual firing. American defenders, finally authorized to engage, opened fire on the retreating Germans, inflicting casualties that later intelligence estimated at between 43 and 57 killed or wounded. Company K suffered exactly 4 casualties: one soldier wounded by German return fire, one with frostbite requiring evacuation, and 2 with minor injuries from their own defensive positions. The disparity was stunning. Callahan's unauthorized wire system had transformed a raid that should have devastated Company K into a humiliating defeat for an experienced German battalion. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate casualties. The 173rd Grenadier Regiment filed reports describing Company K's position as heavily fortified with extensive engineering preparation, leading German division headquarters to cancel additional raids planned for other sectors along the Roa River. The morning of February 12th brought chaos of a different kind. Division headquarters, monitoring radio traffic during the raid, demanded explanations for the defensive preparation that German communications described. When engineering officers arrived at Company K's position to inspect the extensive fortifications that had reportedly stopped a battalion-strength assault, they discovered Callahan's wire network and immediately recognized it as unauthorized construction using salvaged materials. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Brennan, commanding the 310th Infantry Regiment, arrived at Company K by mid-morning to investigate personally. His initial reaction was fury. Callahan had violated regulations regarding unauthorized use of military property, construction of non-standard defensive positions, and individual initiative beyond approved parameters. More seriously, Callahan's actions had created a precedent that threatened military discipline. If every corporal could decide which orders to follow and which to ignore based on personal judgment, chaos would replace command structure. Lieutenant Marsh, facing Brennan's interrogation, accepted full responsibility for authorizing the construction, knowing his career was finished. But Colonel Brennan was also a combat veteran who understood the difference between peacetime regulations and battlefield reality. He spent 2 hours walking Company K's defensive line, studying Callahan's wire network with growing respect. The system demonstrated sophistication that exceeded anything in official engineering manuals. The integration of detection, deterrence, and psychological warfare represented innovation worthy of formal study. More importantly, the results were undeniable. 90 American soldiers had defeated a raid by nearly 300 German veterans, inflicting significant casualties while suffering minimal losses, using nothing except salvaged wire and creative thinking. Brennan interviewed Callahan personally, asking detailed questions about the design principles, construction techniques, and psychological theories underlying the defensive system. Callahan, terrified of court-martial, explained his thinking with the same intensity he had shown Lieutenant Marsh. Wire, Callahan argued, was the most underutilized weapon in the American arsenal because doctrine treated it as passive barrier rather than active psychological tool. The Germans understood this, which was why their defenses were so effective. Americans needed to learn the same lessons. Colonel Brennan made an extraordinary decision. Instead of court-martialing Callahan, he ordered him to document the entire wire system in writing, including detailed diagrams, construction techniques, and psychological principles. Brennan forwarded this documentation to divisional headquarters with a recommendation that Callahan's methods be studied for potential incorporation into official doctrine. Within a week, combat engineers from 3 different divisions visited Company K to examine the wire network and interview Callahan. By March 1945, elements of Callahan's design were being tested at other defensive positions along the Allied line. The Army's resistance to unauthorized innovation remained strong, but battlefield effectiveness ultimately trumped regulatory concerns. Callahan received no official commendation, no medal, no public recognition. He was quietly promoted to sergeant in April 1945, and his personnel file contained a single notation: demonstrated exceptional initiative and technical proficiency in defensive operations. This bureaucratic language concealed one of the most significant tactical innovations of the European theater's final months. The war ended before Callahan's wire techniques could be fully integrated into official doctrine, but their influence persisted. After demobilization in October 1945, Callahan returned to Kansas, married his childhood sweetheart Elizabeth Morrison in December, and operated a radio repair shop identical to his father's for the next 42 years. He rarely discussed his military service and never mentioned the wire network that had saved Company K. His modesty wasn't false humility, but genuine indifference to recognition. He had solved a problem using available resources, nothing more. Other men, he insisted, had done far braver things. In 1953, Lieutenant Marsh, who had remained in the Army and retired as a colonel in 1968, visited Callahan in Kansas. Marsh brought letters from 17 soldiers who had survived the February 12th raid and credited their lives to Callahan's innovation. One letter came from Private First Class Robert Delaney, who wrote, "I was in the foxhole farthest north, convinced I would die that night. When I heard those cans rattling and realized the Germans were tangled in your wire, I understood that cleverness beats courage every time. You saved my life with nothing except copper and creativity." The formal military recognition came decades later in 1991, when the Army's Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth published a historical analysis of improvised defensive systems used during World War II. The study identified Callahan's wire network as among the most effective examples of individual tactical innovation in the European theater. Researchers estimated that the system had prevented casualties that could have reached 60 to 80 American soldiers, while inflicting approximately 50 German casualties and deterring subsequent attacks that might have killed hundreds more across the regiment's entire sector. The total lives saved, directly and indirectly, exceeded 200 soldiers. The study noted that Callahan's techniques had influenced post-war doctrine regarding defensive psychology and the integration of improvised materials into tactical planning. Modern combat engineering manuals, while not explicitly crediting Callahan, incorporated principles he had discovered through desperate experimentation on frozen ground in February 1945. Callahan died on November 7, 2003, at age 81, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Salina Journal made no mention of his military service beyond noting that he was a World War II veteran. His family knew fragments of the story, bits and pieces he had shared during the final years of his life when memory became less guarded. His grandson, Army Captain David Callahan, serving in Iraq during the 2003 invasion, had asked his grandfather for advice about dealing with improvised explosive devices. The elder Callahan had said something his grandson never forgot. "The enemy's greatest weapon is your assumption that they'll fight the way you expect. Break that assumption, and you break their advantage." This philosophy, forged in the desperate hours before the Roa River raid, represented a fundamental truth about warfare that official doctrine often missed. Innovation, not obedience, determined survival when systems failed and orders became obsolete. The lessons from Callahan's wire network extended beyond military applications into fundamental questions about courage, authority, and individual judgment. His decision to disobey orders and construct an unauthorized defensive system demonstrated that true courage sometimes requires defying the very institutions soldiers are sworn to serve. The military structure demands obedience because coordination requires predictability, but battlefield reality frequently presents situations where obedience means death and survival requires improvisation. Callahan understood this tension and resolved it in favor of preserving lives, accepting the risk of court-martial as less significant than the certainty of casualties if he followed orders passively. His story illuminates the uncomfortable truth that hierarchies, while necessary for coordination, can become obstacles to adaptation when circumstances change faster than doctrine can accommodate. The officers who initially condemned his actions eventually recognized their value, but this recognition came only after success validated his judgment. Had the German raid succeeded despite the wire network, Callahan would have faced punishment for the same actions that earned him quiet respect. The irony of Callahan's legacy is that his greatest contribution to military effectiveness came through activities that violated military regulations. The wire network that saved Company K deterred subsequent German attacks and influenced post-war tactical doctrine was built using materials obtained through unauthorized salvage, constructed without engineering approval, and designed according to principles that contradicted official manuals. Yet this unauthorized innovation proved more effective than authorized defensive preparations precisely because it adapted to specific battlefield conditions rather than conforming to standardized procedures. The tension between standardization and adaptation defines military effectiveness in ways that bureaucracies struggle to acknowledge. Callahan's story provides evidence that individual judgment, informed by direct observation and creative thinking, can exceed institutional knowledge in situations where circumstances deviate from planning assumptions. This lesson applies far beyond military contexts into any domain where complex systems interact with unpredictable environments. The mathematical realities of the Roa River raid demonstrate the multiplier effect of psychological warfare. Company K's 90 defenders faced approximately 280 German attackers, a ratio that conventional analysis suggested would result in American casualties potentially reaching 50% or higher, given the attackers' advantages of surprise, numbers, and combat experience. Instead, the wire network created force multiplication through deterrence and confusion, transforming the operational mathematics from 90 versus 280 into perceived hundreds versus 280 in German assessment. The actual defensive capabilities hadn't changed, but the psychological perception of those capabilities altered enemy behavior sufficiently to prevent the attack from achieving its objectives. This represents a fundamental principle of asymmetric warfare. Perception shapes reality when perception determines decisions. Callahan's wire network was fundamentally a communication system, sending messages to German soldiers about American defensive preparation that were factually false but psychologically true enough to trigger retreat. The story of Corporal James Henry Callahan and his disturbing wire trap built from radio antenna represents more than a tactical curiosity from World War II's final months. It demonstrates how individual courage manifests not only in facing enemy fire, but in defying friendly authorities when those authorities cling to procedures that battlefield reality has rendered obsolete. It illustrates how ingenuity multiplies combat power more effectively than additional soldiers or weapons, when ingenuity addresses psychological rather than physical dimensions of warfare. It proves that innovation often emerges from unexpected sources, from corporals rather than colonels, from radio repairmen rather than academy graduates, from desperate improvisation rather than careful planning. Most fundamentally, it reminds us that warfare, like all human endeavors, remains ultimately a contest of wills and perceptions, where cleverness can defeat strength and creativity can triumph over conventional power. The copper wire that Callahan wove into an elaborate defensive network came from destroyed equipment considered worthless by official logistics. The techniques he employed violated regulations designed to ensure standardization and control. The decision to proceed despite explicit orders reflected insubordination that military justice systems exist to punish. Yet this combination of salvage, violation, and insubordination saved over 200 lives and contributed to tactical knowledge that influenced combat doctrine for decades. What shocked you most about Corporal Callahan's unauthorized innovation? Was it the audacity of constructing an elaborate defensive system using salvaged antenna wire while facing potential court-martial? Was it the psychological sophistication of his design, turning cheap copper into a weapon more effective than machine guns? Was it the military's eventual recognition that disobedience, in this case, represented the highest form of duty? Or was it simply the mathematical impossibility of 90 men defeating nearly 300 attackers through nothing except cleverness and wire? Comment below and share this story with anyone who believes that courage always means following orders, that innovation requires official approval, or that ordinary people cannot change outcomes through individual action. The historical record contains thousands of stories like Callahan's, tales of unsung heroes whose names appear in no monuments, whose actions violated regulations, and whose courage manifested in ways that authority structures struggle to acknowledge. These stories deserve preservation and sharing because they reveal truths about human capability, moral courage, and effective action that official histories often obscure. The wire trap that terrified a German battalion existed for only a few weeks before the war's end, and subsequent occupation rendered it obsolete, but the principles it embodied, the courage it represented, and the lives it saved remain relevant across decades and conflicts. Remember Corporal James Henry Callahan, radio repairman from Kansas, who saved over 200 lives using copper wire, creative thinking, and the moral courage to disobey when obedience meant death.